the size, the severity, the intensity, and the complexity of fire, whether that's wildfire, urban fire, is growing at rates that we're simply just not able to keep up with, right? So the scale of change is occurring faster than our ability to adapt to it, but then also to mitigate it. And I think that's where the complexity comes in. So if we continue to kind of use the same tools, the same mindsets, kind of the historical approach, the cultural approach that we've had, that's not going to change what the future is going to look like. So that's the duality with fire, right? So we actually need more of it. We just don't need it at the intensity and severity that we're seeing it at. So how do we flip that switch? How do we make people and our own fire suppression workforce understand that there is a difference between, good fire and bad fire, and we can be stewards of the good fire, and we can also be very aggressive in our response to, high intensity fire that's actually going to have, really bad downstream consequences. We can do both.
Hey folks, what's happening? Welcome to Your Forest. My name is Matthew Christoph, and on this podcast, we talk about the environment and the science of sustainability. Now, today's episode is another deep dive into wildfire and our society's relationship to it. How do we improve that? How do we make that better? How do we get comfortable with wildfire as a reality going forward? And to have that conversation, we brought on two people. So first and foremost, we brought on Marissa Christansen. She is the executive director of the Climate and Wildfire Institute out of California. And they are a nonprofit that connects science to public policy and decision-making to try and enhance wildfire resilience, right? So trying to change our society's relationship to fire, including landscape and knowledge mobilization and all that kind of stuff. And so a perfect person to talk to about how do we start to make changes, right? And then also we brought on Chris Anthony. Chris Anthony is a forester. He's a strategic wildfire advisor and the former CAL FIRE Chief Deputy Director. So an amazing person to talk to with lots of experience with fire, obviously. He can speak directly to some of the barriers, some of the things slowing us down, and some of the technology that's coming out, some of the policy stuff. And it was just a really, really in-depth, interesting conversation about what's holding us back from making the changes that supposedly we all know need to be made. And a lot of it is about intentional fire. So not just about stopping wildfires, firefighting. This is about mitigating wildfire, about wildfire resilience, right? So how do we do that? We do that through intentional fire, through Indigenous cultural fire practices, through prescribed burning, through all kinds of different ways where we're investing in our landscape to try and reduce wildfire risk, not just responding to wildfires. So, yeah, fantastic episode. Sponsors. Wes Fraser is the number one sponsor for 2025. They've been with me since nearly the very beginning. Thank you, Wes Fraser, for all of your unwavering support. I really do appreciate it. It has been fantastic. Also, GreenLink Forestry has been with me since the beginning, and I could not do this without them. Thank you, GreenLink. Now, without any further messing around, let's dive into this conversation all about shifting our relationship to fire. Here we go. So first of all, thank you again to both of you for joining me. I'm excited to speak with you about all things wildfire in California and hopefully the rest of North America as well. And before we go anywhere, we've got to find out who you are, right? So Marissa, I would like to start with you and just tell us who you are, who you're with, and why you have dedicated this part of your life to helping society live better with wildfire.
Yeah, thank you so much for having me and for having Chris. It's great to be here. I am the executive director of the Climate and Wildfire Institute. Been with the Institute for a little under a year, and we are extremely focused on fighting the wildfire crisis, particularly in the Western United States,
Mm-hmm.
and particularly as it relates to sort of the climate-driven effects. Why did I choose this? Why this career path? How did I find myself here? These are large questions that I don't always have the answers to, but I have really spent the last 20 years working in spaces that are trying to bring a little positive change to the world. I have a master's in urban planning. I found out very quickly that being a planner for local government, which is what most of my cohorts end up doing, is just not my cup of tea. I am a little bit more of a rabble-rouser and kind of a anti-authoritarian. So the nonprofit world not only suited me, but was sort of the only world that suited me.
Mm-hmm.
And I just really fell in love with the passion and the energy that comes with any mission-driven organization. The people that you end up meeting, the causes that you end up working on really do bring a lot of meaning and purpose to the 8, 9, 10-hour days that we all end up working in our day jobs.
Mm-hmm.
And I had 2 kids a couple years ago. I have a 5 and a 6-year-old daughter, and they really have also underscored for me what's important and really wanting to make sure that I use my time and do what I can to try to leave this world in a little bit better condition for them. And that is proving to be a challenge. But living here in California, there is sort of no better and more urgent cause to work on than things like wildfire or water.
Awesome. Thank you. Yeah, that's, I can totally connect with that because I think, I also have a 6-year-old daughter, and it definitely drives your focus in a different direction and forces you to kind of think more holistically about the decisions you're making, the things you're spending your time on, and what you're putting your energy into. So I can totally appreciate that. Yeah, that's awesome. Thank you, Marissa, for sharing that. I appreciate it. Looking forward to, I can tell already we're going to have a very genuine conversation. It's going to be great. Okay. So, Chris, same question to you. What's going on with you, and why have you dedicated, seems like basically your entire career towards helping society figure out this wildfire issue?
Yeah, no, thanks, Matt. So appreciate you having Marissa and I on your show. So my name's Chris Anthony. And like you said, my career was with CAL FIRE. I actually started in resource management and forestry with the department very, very early on in my career. My background was actually in forestry, as was my education. But very early on in my career, I was pulled over into fire protection with the department. And so, I had the pleasure of working in fire protection training, fire prevention, law enforcement, administration, department leadership positions throughout my career with CAL FIRE, and am privileged enough to end up as the chief deputy director of the department working out of Sacramento, which was by far the best job that I had throughout my entire career. And so coming out of a career with CAL FIRE, there was really 4 things that I wanted to focus on. One was, how do we return good fire back into our fire adapted ecosystems? The second was really thinking about community wildfire preparedness and mitigation efforts that we need to put into place to protect our communities. The third was the policy and the legislative framework to make all of those things happen. And then lastly, and which wasn't one thing that I was aiming for, but it kind of came my way, was really how we connect innovations and technology to the wildfire community in a meaningful way. Because I think there's a big gap there. And so currently, I really have this unique pleasure of being able to work with academic, nonprofit, philanthropic, and private organizations, of one of which is the Climate and Wildfire Institute that Marissa is the executive director of, as part of some work that the Moore Foundation is doing with their wildfire resilience initiative. So I get to work with the CWI team on a daily basis, which is awesome. So, and then having that framework of kind of those 4 things kind of keeps me pointed in the right direction in terms of what that North Star needs to look like. As Marissa mentioned, obviously the impacts that we're seeing are, while magnified in California, because some of the impacts that we've seen, we know that those are impacts that are not just specific to California, but also the Western states and nationally. Certainly in Canada, we're seeing the size and severity of fires much higher than they've been previously as well. So this is a global challenge that we have ahead of us. Yep,
absolutely. Even as far as Australia, right? It's colonialism had an interesting impact on how fire is treated on the landscape, and it's kind of was a global thing, that colonialism. So it's unsurprisingly the wildfire has done similar things elsewhere. Yeah, it's. But yeah, I can appreciate that too. Like from your perspective, being able to have your hand in a few different organizations with different perspectives, that's got to definitely help hone in on where some of the maybe inconsistencies are, or maybe how you can help move things forward a little more, aggressively or effectively. So that's awesome. Great. Very, very cool. Great. I can't wait to have this conversation with you guys. I'm looking forward to it. So, first of all, I guess we'll have to get into CWI. What exactly? So, Marissa, we'll start with you. What is the Climate and Wildfire Institute? You said before it's a nonprofit, but what's its purpose? What's its focus?
So we are what is called a boundary organization, which means we work in between sort of different sectors. In our case, academia, policy, and research. To bridge those gaps, and specifically to make sure that we are aiding in new technology, new data, whatever is needed to make on the ground firefighting and mitigation more effective or more responsive, faster, whatever the issue may be. We work to connect those needs that on the ground practitioners have or communities may have to research agendas to make sure that we have the information and the data that we need to actually make smart, informed decisions, and then use that to educate our policymakers to have them hopefully make smart, informed decisions at the policy level as well.
Yeah, it's so needed now, right? By the time this comes out, the 2 episodes previous to this were almost exclusively on dialogue in wildfire mitigation and land management, right? And the need for exactly what the CWI does, which is taking these multiple perspectives and trying to push them into a space that we can move forward, right? Because I think up until now, I'm assuming that California is similar, being a Western society, that we have a lot of interest in nature, and we have a lot of professions and professionals that have their very specific perspective, and we tend to hammer at nature with our specific viewpoint, and there's a need to collect all those views if we want to do this properly and comprehensively, right? And so the need for an organization like CWI, I think, it's never been more apparent than today, right? Something that can collect the information and help bring people together.
I so agree, and it's hard work. It's hard to thread the needle. It's hard to kind of herd all the cats and make sure everybody feels like they are being heard. And then I think that the hardest piece of kind of this pipeline of ideas to action is that at some point, someone, our decision makers or policymakers, whomever, will have to make a hard decision. Because as you just mentioned, we do kind of all come at nature from our own perspective. And there are trade-offs in choosing whichever perspective that you may want to implement. And so I think really arming our decision makers and our leaders with the right information so that when they do make a tough decision, when they do decide that, certain mitigations are needed in one community and maybe not the other, or one forest gets a kind of fuel treatment and reduction that it needs as opposed to another area. These are all things that people, of course, have opinions on and should have opinions on. And so making decisions about what to do with our public resources and our public lands can be really scary. And that's where I think having the right information hopefully makes our decision makers feel a little bit more confident in the direction they choose to go.
So important, right? Because I think, like in that situation, you're never going to make everybody happy, but making sure that we can make the most comprehensive decisions is crucial, right? And knowing you can stand behind it and be like, with the information I had, this was the right choice. And so, yeah, it's crucial in this day and time for sure. Awesome.
Exactly.
Very, very cool.
Exactly.
And I'll just add, so I was with CAL FIRE when CWI was established, and I was really excited about the organization. One, because you look at not only the staff, but the board members of CWI, and there's a lot of capacity there to be able to do work on behalf of the state of California and to bring together these really unique skill sets to solve really big problems. And also having, this network or this capacity to be able to do the really important work that needs to get done, but then also thinking about how you translate science to policy. And I felt that CWI really could fill a very unique role there. And then also what I really appreciate about the Institute is this really deep dive into data and technology and really understanding how to quantify the work that we're doing and the touch points that has on everything from insurance to land use planning to community risk reduction to landscape scale resiliency. I mean, we still have a lot of big challenges that we need to wrap our arms around. And I think CWI is really well suited to be able to do that and to bring together a lot of practitioners from really across the Western United States to solve some of these really big problems. So there is a tremendous amount of opportunity in having the convening power of CWI as an organization. There was a big gap there that we didn't have filled, and CWI is like really well suited to be able to take a lot of that on. It's a heavy lift, but it's something that's really needed for California and the West.
Oh yeah. Yeah, we need it in Canada as well, right? Like it's something that there's a few provinces that have stuff like that, but that's hard, right? Like how do you bring together all of the viewpoints that could seemingly be at complete odds and try to move that forward in a productive way, right? Like it's a monumental task but crucially needed. And so yeah, it's very, very cool, very exciting stuff. So yeah, I'm looking forward to seeing what kind of insights you guys have gathered during this process and during your experience here. So, Chris, I want to ask you about, before we dive into this whole conversation about, intentional fire and kind of where we perceive fire management and mitigation going. What is it, do you think, about the current system of wildland fire management that is problematic, that requires such a all-inclusive perspective to be able to find the solution to, right? Why is this so complicated? What is going on?
So clearly, we have wildfires, right? But then once a wildfire enters into the built environment, it really ceases to be a wildfire at that point, and it's really an urban fire. Totally. And the size, the severity, the intensity, and the complexity of fire, whether that's wildfire, urban fire, is growing at rates that like we're simply just not able to keep up with, right? So the scale of change is occurring faster than our ability to adapt to it, but then also to mitigate it. And I think that's where the complexity comes in. So
gotcha. If
we continue to kind of use the same tools, the same mindsets, kind of the historical approach, the cultural approach that we've had, that's not going to change what the future is going to look like. So I really think we have to reframe how we think about fire and also be more mindful about how we implement our work across the landscape and in communities. And certainly, we'll touch on this, I'm sure, more. Good fire plays a big role in that. And for sure. So I think that's what's caused the complexity. I think the systems, we have systems in place, but those systems need to essentially change in terms of how we approach this problem. And this is not like simply a government solution either, right? I mean, it's like we're finally to the point now where we're seeing a very cross-sector network of people coming in trying to solve this problem. And I think that's somewhat a little bit new in terms of like, how do we leverage all of these different organizations and entities that are coming in trying to solve this problem? Because even with a department the size of CAL FIRE, it's not able to solve this problem by itself. It needs these partnerships to be able to solve these really complex issues that we're seeing with the way fires are burning, not only in landscapes, but in communities as well.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. In the previous episode, I was talking with some folks and they were saying that, wildfire, it's like you said, it's no longer just a government issue. This is an all of society problem and it requires an all of society solution, right? It's getting worse. Fires are getting bigger, more severe. There's more people on the landscape. So as a result, we have more risk. It's just getting out of hand. And the old approaches just don't cut it anymore. So, so I'm curious as to, Marissa, I'll move over to you. I'm curious how CWI envisions this. I'm going to use the word, I might be overused in the environmental management world, but I'm going to use the term paradigm shift, right? I think people are often talking about this. We need a paradigm shift in landscape management or a paradigm shift in wildfire management and that kind of thing. How does CWI envision that new paradigm?
I mean, I think we definitely envision a new paradigm where technology and also just good old-fashioned human ingenuity and footwork are both deployed in maybe a more robust balance than they are currently. Mm-hmm. At the end of the day, I don't know if we have a dog in the fight of exactly what the paradigm needs to look like. We just know it needs to be a little bit more nimble and quickly responsive. And also looking ahead at just accepting that wildfire and urban fires are going to happen. It's not something that we can totally avoid. And so how are we going to prepare ourselves as individuals, as landowners, as communities? What is it that we need to be prepared to do differently?
Yes.
And so I kind of look at the LA fires that happened in January as a good example of both the efficacy of CAL FIRE for sure. I mean, they really came in with mutual aid to save us in a way that our urban fire departments probably would have been really strapped to do on their own, because it was this mix, right, of a wildland fire becoming an urban fire and 100-mile-an-hour wind and neighborhoods that were built really close together and so on and so forth. And so I think a good example in that is the type of mutual aid and collaboration that did happen between a bunch of different state, federal, and local departments. And a great example for collaboration needing to happen before a fire even starts.
Right. Yes.
And so I think as our climate continues to change, as it changes faster and more drastically than even our top scientists were able to predict, it's sort of time to look at our fire practices and also how we're preparing together, right?
Yeah.
So we know it's a super dry season and we know we're getting those really high, violent Santa Ana winds. And we know that neighborhoods are situated right in the WUI. What are we doing to sort of station people or technology, right, to be able to address impending disaster? And I know that sounds a little doom and gloom, but it's sort of just like accepting, I'm a big believer in just sort of accepting what is and planning for that.
Absolutely. I think you've got enough history just in the last, 5-6 years alone to say that, like, hey, this isn't doom and gloom. This is the reality. And let's not get caught with our pants down again. And let's try and figure this out. Right. And it's such a huge problem though. So it's not like you can just be spend more money on firefighters. That's not the solution. It's so much more comprehensive than that. And I also appreciate that you're saying, CWI doesn't have a vision per se. We're just trying to lubricate the process so that the knowledge holders and the researchers and the people that do know and have some ideas can work it out together, right? Try and make that happen, be the space where that facilitation and collaboration can happen. So I could appreciate that because that's such a needed thing, right? So fantastic.
Yeah,
Thank you.
Hoping.
Yeah, right. Yeah. So I'm gathering from this that obviously from the whole point of this conversation was getting into intentional fire and how that might play a role in this as well. But before we do get into the idea of intentional fire and that kind of thing, I do want to talk about some of the more traditional fire mitigation strategies and maybe kind of where the focus on those might need to shift as well, because I'm assuming we're wanting to see a shift in it kind of everything, right? So, because intentional fire to me that's pre-planning, right? Like we're doing before the fires start, we're going to do some intentional fire, we're going to do some work before to try and reduce risk. So before we get to that, I would like to, I want to ask you, Chris, is there something maybe it's as simple as just a perspective that in firefighting, or maybe it's the way it's deployed? Is there something in firefighting that needs to change in and of itself to be more prepared for this? Like one example, I imagine Marissa was just talking about the wild and urban interface and that challenges that presents, right? I got to imagine, I know in Canada we have that problem all the time. There's no one group that's ready for that, because we have wildland firefighters and we have urban firefighters, and that interface is a whole new ball game, right? And so is it training? Is it what is it about the firefighting aspect that needs to change or needs more, investment or whatever it is?
So I kind of taken all of the above approach. So I think that at least right now in the current ecosystem that we are with fire and wildfire, we still need to be making investments in response and fast fire response and early detection systems. But then on the flip side, I think we talk about workforce and lack of workforce to be able to do certain things, especially on the mitigation side of the equation. And I would like to see the fire service and the wildfire community actually be the ones that help work us out of this situation as well. And so what I mean by that is thinking about how does the suppression workforce that we have in place across the United States and Canada, how do we engage that workforce to actually be that beneficial fire workforce as well? So, not only do we have suppression response strategies, but we have beneficial fire response strategies as well. And at the local, state, and federal level, I think we also need to have a better appreciation of that this is all of our problem. So, when it comes to homes burning in a local community, that's a federal problem as much as it is a local problem. And so that's why I think you're seeing more federal strategies and federal legislation being stood up to address some of these issues at the local level, because ultimately the downstream economic impacts hit everyone. It doesn't really matter whether you're a local, state, or federal government. And the downstream economic impacts have massive ramifications well beyond just that community that's been impacted as well. So I think we need to take much more of a holistic approach. And when it comes to the mitigation activities that occur, whether that's, defensible space inspections, incentivizing home hardening, fuels reduction in the wildland urban interface, prescribed fire, we have a workforce. And granted, that workforce is there primarily for emergency response. But when those emergencies aren't happening, how do we ensure that firefighter that started today has a much different future than the one that I had when I was working with CAL FIRE? Because I think if we have firefighters that are experiencing the same things today, 30 years from now, or it's worse, then we really haven't, done ourselves any favors. And I also think from clearly from a mental health standpoint and the stresses that we see on the workforce now as a result of the changes that we're seeing with how fires are burning, we can't have that future, right? So I think we both have a responsibility to, and a shift in that culture to be able to move our ways out of this. Having said that, though, we still need to develop more of a mitigation workforce, and there are certain gaps there for sure that we need to fill and get a dedicated workforces that can do more prescribed fire fuels reduction. That type of work is going to be really important. But but I don't want us to miss the fact that we actually have a workforce in place. It's just changing that culture and that mindset so that they see themselves as part of the solution as well.
Gotcha. So it really is like a cultural shift in the way we're perceiving fire, and we're not just firefighters. Now we're fire stewards. We're something, just shifting that idea of like fire bad to just like, hey, how do we steer this away from bad, areas of concern and that kind of thing. I'm hearing like more training, more expose those frontline people to more ideas, and to just getting the ball rolling and kind of changing everything all at once, right? We just need more of everything is what it sounds like.
Yeah. Well, I think obviously, so that's the duality with fire, right? So we actually need more of it. We just don't need it at the intensity and severity that we're seeing it at. So how do we flip that switch? How do we make people and our own fire suppression workforce understand that there is a difference between, good fire and bad fire, and we can be stewards of the good fire, and we can also be very aggressive in our response to, high intensity fire that's actually going to have, really bad downstream consequences. We can do both. I just think that's a change in culture, that's training, that's, but I think we're learning as we go too, right? So hopefully this becomes more in the conscience of, not only the fire service community, but obviously, in the public eye as well.
Yes. And I just want to add, just so I like to make sure that anybody that listens to this can follow along, even if they're not, baptized in the world of fire management or whatever. So I just want to add into, because you made a statement about the we need more fire, actually, just not at the severity and size and wild, just like massive fires that are endangering everything that we have today. And I just want to reinforce that with, Western society. We got here and we suppressed all the fires because there were timber resources and there was people in the landscape, and we wanted to stop all the fires. And that was the mandate for the last 100 or so years. And as a result, we have a fuel buildup, and this is why we're seeing, along with climate change, right, and like longer fire seasons and more opportunity, that's why we're seeing these big catastrophic fires. And so anyways, I just wanted to provide that. I know you guys know this. I just wanted to provide that context for anyone that's listening that might have caught that comment and not really understood the full context of it. So, and then this is one step further into the question, Chris. I'm curious as to because I feel like this conversation of the need for like a paradigm shift in fire management has been going on for like years, like arguably a decade, right? And what do you think's taken so long? Is it just that this is just a big boat to turn around and to get the balls moving in the right direction, or are there power struggles? Is there some kind of, some political baloney going on that's stopping this from moving? Or is it just that it's just so much to move? From your perspective, obviously I'm not saying you're the definitive answer on this. I just like, yeah.
No, I'm definitely not. So, I would say that, two things. It's always easier to fund suppression resources than it is mitigation or prevention activities. And I think that's just true politically. So it can be hard when there's limited public funds to justify the funding for prevention and mitigation. Although, even though we know that those small investments can return a massive return on investment. But the other thing is, I don't think that we necessarily have all of the tools in the toolbox that we need to be more nuanced in our approach to unplanned ignitions on the landscape. And so one of the things that we are working on, and CWI has had a lot of conversations as well in this space, is, standing up, believe it or not, it's a low Earth orbit satellite system for wildfire detection, suppression, and response. Where we can have a much more nuanced understanding of new ignitions and understanding, what those ignitions are going to do under specific weather circumstances and fuels and topography. So if I know going into a fire what's going to happen very, very early on, I can make a much different decision about what I'm going to do with that fire. And right now, we really don't have those tools in our toolbox. So as a result, it's just a suppression mindset.
I see.
So as we give responders more tools to make, more nuanced decisions based on what a fire is or is not going to do under specific circumstances, then we can actually start turning that needle and giving our first responders the tools that they need to be more effective.
So going from fight all fire everywhere to let's fight fire smartly, using as much data and modeling that we can possibly get our hands on. And then that, of course, that makes sense, right? Like better data is going to give you better management, just period. You have focus points, and so that totally checks out. Having a designated satellite to keep a live view of what fires are doing and how you can respond in real time, of course, that's priceless. That makes sense. It is interesting to see that there is so much conversation happening now, right? Though it does seem like everybody in this world is kind of on the same page. We're all like, hey, we got to move this train. And we're like, hey, how do we go about doing this, right? And it's slow, but it seems to be happening. And so with that, I want to get into this idea of pre-planning, of intentional fire, of getting more intentional fire, more fire on the land base, good fire, right? Intentional fire. So, Marissa, the idea of getting more intentional fire on the land base. Why exactly that terminology? Do you think the intentional fire, and what can intentional fire do for our situation that we're in now?
Yeah. So, in terms of that terminology, intentional fire, it's a good kind of catch-all phrase for a bunch of different helpful, beneficial fire types that can be a part of our toolbox, right? One of those practices is cultural burning, by our Indigenous tribes, both here in the United States as well as in Canada. A lot of these tribes have practices that they've been doing for thousands of years, long before we got here, as a way of both demonstrating their cultural norms as well as managing the landscape that they have been stewards of for all this time. And it's really hard for them to get basically the permitting and permissions that they need to be able to do those practices. But you can imagine pretty easily that if you have 100 tribes across the landscape that are all able to practice their cultural burning, that might actually be a significant footprint in terms of acres treated. Another type of intentional fire is prescribed burning or controlled burns, where an area in the landscape is identified as high risk, very densely forested, and it's a way of clearing fuel, basically understory and brush. So those are just two types of beneficial fire that the practice of, I think, is really important. And we do, as Chris pointed out earlier, have workforce that both can be trained to do it and already are trained to do it, but actually getting through the red tape and the regulation, that really is the hallmark of our whole society, not just in fire and getting permission for that. But if you think about any environmental practice, any environmental planning, there are a whole series of regulations that we have to get through for good reason to make sure that all of the different, maybe unintended consequences have been weighed. But in this time right now, where we are facing a very rapidly growing wildland fire crisis, looking at some of those regulations, specifically around cultural burning, specifically for prescribed burns that are being done by agencies that do know how to do them, it may be time to kind of relax some of those standards, which is something that the state of California is doing now in response to our fire state of emergency.
Yeah, that totally makes sense. There's so much opportunity there, but there's always these barriers, right? These to change. There's policy, there's regulation, there's public perception, there's fear of. Anytime you're putting fire in the landscape, the public perception of fire is one of terrifying fear, right? So like, how do you go like, hey, actually, we're actually pretty good. There's a lot of people here that are pretty good at managing that and not having it turn into this thing, right? And so I almost feel like that's the first barrier, is just getting people on board with like, hey, by the way, tomorrow we're going to be doing a prescribed fire fuel reduction, and there's going to be a bunch of smoke, and you don't have to freak out. We got you. Like, we're covered. And like, just getting people okay with that, especially in a place like California where there's so many people directly just infused into that wildland urban interface, right? Like it's just all through there. So would you say it's fair to say that that's like one of the biggest barriers trying to get through in getting fire back on the landscape? That's, intentional fire, as you say?
Yeah, I do think that's right. And there's probably people who would disagree and maybe think that the bottleneck or the barrier kind of happens someplace else. But I am a huge believer in the power of movements. I come from, a number of different spaces that were dependent on, the movement of the public, a group of citizenry, really taking up an issue, whether it's here in Los Angeles. One of my causes was to restore the LA River back into an actual river. It's been encased in concrete for 50 years now, so it's slow going, but nonetheless, right. A movement was born. And another one, getting bike lanes and road diets on the streets here as a way of mitigating traffic and making things more walkable and livable. These are things that get a lot of attention and a lot of resource these days, but it wasn't always so, because if these ideas, just like intentional fire, exist in the shadows or exist behind closed doors in our government and with our decision makers, it gets to stay there and it gets to move at the speed of bureaucracy, which we don't have time for, right? So if you give it to the public, if you take some time to educate the public, because we're all paying attention, we're all scared, right? We all noticed the LA fires. Something like 2,500 structures burned, and people remain displaced today and up against serious health consequences for those that are still in those neighborhoods. So this has our attention, not just in California, but across the country. This is a really important opportunity to galvanize people to start demanding different practice. And to start letting our elected officials know that if they decide to stick their neck out and do something a little bit differently and make a recommendation or a decision that maybe they wouldn't have made 5 years ago, that they have our support, the public's support. So I absolutely think public education and engagement and actual empowerment is key to any major change that you want to make. Change is hard. Lasting change is even harder. And it really kind of takes everybody.
Yes, absolutely. Well, that totally makes sense. Because unless you have the support of the people, how do you move any of these, especially, publicly funded things like firefighting in any direction, right? So you need the public support. So what kind of movement have you seen in that? Like, have you noticed a tangible shift in public perception in California?
Yes, I have. I mean, I would say, just in my experience personally, it used to be, visiting my cousin up in Arrowhead, which is a little mountain community not that far outside of LA. There's a lot of knowledge there around wildfires are going to happen. It's future certain, so be prepared. But that was really that sort of knowledge and awareness and willingness to take responsibility kind of was left in our mountain communities. And I hear a lot more conversation today in an urban environment around just knowledge of the wildland urban interface, the WUI, which was a term that I had never heard anyone say before this last year.
Sure,
at least out in the general public. So I do see a shift, and I see a lot of podcasts like this that are talking about wildfires or beneficial fires. This is something that's out in the zeitgeist. I just don't think we have a cohesive, galvanized movement yet. but those
Sure.
things are coming. We didn't always have a climate movement. We didn't always have a sustainability movement. These are all things that do come to fruition. And unfortunately, these massive disasters do happen. And I think we know never to let a good crisis go to waste. And so I'm hoping that these things are motivators for folks. But I think one of the biggest barriers in getting people to pay attention and make their own changes to their own properties or their own practices, one of the barriers is that we are overwhelmed as human beings with information and with planetary crisis. And it can be stifling and it can be paralytic. It's hard to know what each of us are supposed to be doing. And so my hope is that CWI can help play a role in really amplifying those organizations, those individuals that do have good information that people can take individual action on.
Yeah.
Because I think this is a moment to really try to get to those folks that are feeling aware and motivated, and just give them the tools that they need to be a little bit of a master of their own destiny here. We are, no matter how well prepared and how on top of it our fire resources, our fire departments are going to be at the end of the day, we are living in a world with increasing compounded crises. And I think it's going to mean more and more that each of us have to sort of take responsibility for our own well-being and that of our property and our community.
Yeah. And this is more of a cultural question but either one of you can answer this one. Do you think it'll be necessary, or have you maybe seen the shift already in holding the media to task, because they get all of this activity and hubbub from these big bad fires, right, that are causing so much damage. And I get that makes good news. That's what sells, right? But has there been any push to maybe hold those organizations to task and being like, that's fine, do that. Also, right before or right after you're posting all that stuff about how bad these fires are and what's going on, can you also include something about intentional fire or something about just try to level out the playing field? Because I feel like that's pre-internet. That was the big problem, right? It was just the only time the public heard about fires is when it was burning someone's home. And so has there been any movement there, or maybe there's been a natural shift? Maybe the media has seen that people want to see the full story and not just the danger. I don't know. Either one of you can answer. I'm not sure if anyone has anything they want to say or noticed regarding that.
Yeah, I mean, Chris, I'm sure you've probably noticed some sort of larger arc than I have in my short time in this space. But even in just the last few months with the LA fires, I've noticed a shift. Our local media here, the Times specifically, I think did a pretty good job in covering not just the drama of the fire, but the aftermath and what science is saying about what caused those fires and what could and could not have been done. We also started these fires with a whole lot of drama and talk about recalling our mayor and things like that. And, it doesn't even matter whether or not you're a fan of hers. At the end of the day, the mayor couldn't have done anything differently with the conditions that we were handed. And so I was disappointed to have so much energy and attention wasted on basically soap drama instead of actual information.
Right.
But yeah, aside from that, I do think there's like a little bit of a shift happening. Yeah.
I think Marissa covered it really well. I think a couple things. One, it depends on the journalist and really how much the journalist actually understands about this space and the nuances, behind fire and some of the ecosystem processes there. I think it also depends on the medium as well. So, the national news covers these fires much differently than, let's say, KTLA in Los Angeles or the Los Angeles Times. And so I think it's incumbent on us, just to, be looking at both local news and national news. And generally that story is going to be much more nuanced at the local level as they cover local stories and really try to understand what happened and why. Whereas, on the national news, you're just generally going to get, just kind of the big cover story, right? And kind of the big gotchas that are going to come out of it. Also, I think it's really important that we have the right voices. So, in journalism, oftentimes there's this desire to present two sides to a story, and which is appropriate most of the time. But sometimes, especially when it comes to issues around science and really being able to kind of focus in on what is causing the problem and how do we mitigate our way out of it. I do think it's really important that, from a journalistic standpoint, that we're making sure that some voices aren't coming into the conversation that actually aren't helpful in terms of our ability to mitigate our way out of this. And and I think it's, to be fair, I think journalists are trying to they want to cover both sides of a story. And I think for the most part, it's fair the way that it is covered, but sometimes it actually can do more harm than good with really, again, trying to educate the public about the cause and effect and really how we need to be thinking kind of more holistically about the activities that need to happen, both at the landscape level and within a community to protect critical infrastructure, homes, our watersheds. And because the solutions are there. It's not like we don't know what needs to get done. And so just keeping our focus on those things that are going to actually turn that risk needle, I think, are important, especially when it comes to media, because media is an opportunity for us to be able to talk about what needs to be done, to educate the public, to have more of a common voice and a common message, so that people don't walk away with thinking that, if only this one thing had been in place, we would have had a different outcome.
You don't want to simplify.
Right. Yeah. So it is complex, but also I think it's like the public, they do want to know, they do want to understand why this occurred and how to prevent something like that from happening in the future.
Totally. People are generally curious, right? They want to know. That's why the internet is so successful, right? It's just a matter of wading your way through all the baloney to find the good stuff. So I had a professor in university who, I remember we were giving a presentation, and anyways, long story short, the answer to the question was, we need to educate the public. And he's like, oh yeah, okay. So what problem in society do you think wouldn't be solved by that solution? And I'm like, So my question, Marissa, is how do you get the traction you need? I mean, the internet is a huge resource. Obviously, I think that has naturally helped move things forward in a way that wasn't true even 10 years ago, right? But this is a big question, right? So if one of the big barriers is public perception, how do we get the friction moving in a real way? What do we have to do differently to make this change?
So Chris was saying it depends on the journalist, right? And similarly, I think it's about finding the right messenger, right?
Sure.
Leaders and institutions that are embedded locally at the neighborhood level, things like churches, schools, trying to locate those resources that already are trusted sources of information and sort of nexus points for a given community, and working with them to make sure that the right information is getting out, and not just information, but actual tools that folks can use and deploy, and that somebody is there to answer questions, that they know what steps they can take, or they know which elected official they can talk to about their property's safety or about what they think needs to be done next. And so I think it is about kind of getting down to the grassroots level and making sure that those organizations and those individuals are resourced in whatever way we can help them be resourced.
That totally makes sense. You're almost creating a little, just like a network of, even if God forbid CWI went down or something, if you do spend the last 10 years reaching out to all of these community organizations, then they're going to keep that message going regardless and keep pushing it. And hopefully that makes sense to me. Absolutely. My initial thought, I was like, are they just going to find, I mean, it's California. You guys got all the Hollywood stars, right? You get Tom Hanks on the TV saying like, all right, everybody's got to firewise their home or something. And I'm sure that would be effective too, but your answer is much more nuanced and I like it a lot better. So,
I mean, yeah, gosh, in any nonprofit and any kind of cause-driven organization, there's always this conversation around which celebrity, which famous spokesperson can we get to carry this message? And those moments are important and they do help cast a wider net for the type of person that maybe hears your message. But what I see over and over again is it's just a blip, because there is so much noise. There are so many different events and crises that people are paying attention to. Totally. Tom Hanks telling us to fireproof our home, I think would be noticed and then also forgotten if it doesn't actually then come with here's what that means and here's where you can get these resources. And I think that's one thing that we all fall down on in public education and communication is not just taking the message out, but then actually providing folks with what they need to take action.
Yeah. And that consistency of that message being out there and not going away. Just you keep inundated with that message over and over and over until it can't not be part of your narrative of that topic, right? Yeah.
Exactly.
I like that. I know that's fantastic. It's something I didn't consider, but I guess that's sales 101, right? Like you just need to So just like, I don't know why that. Yeah, exactly. Right. No, that totally makes sense. Okay. That's very cool. I'm excited to see where this goes. And I would like to see some movements like that elsewhere as well. Cause I think you're right. Like that totally makes sense. If you can get a self-perpetuating machine in the public eye moving forward and pushing that out all the time through other entities, like, yeah, of course, use that. That's going to be longer lasting and have a bigger impact long term for sure. Makes sense. So I want to shift gears away from the public perception thing and move into getting more intentional fire on the ground. So earlier, Marissa, you pointed out the difference that it's important to recognize that there's differences between, prescribed fire from a fuel reductions perspective simply for the idea of reducing fire, and the difference between Indigenous cultural burning as a cultural aspect. And it's not just about hazard reduction, but it's also about revitalizing culture and community involvement and all that type of stuff, and recognizing the differences between those two. And I think, and I don't know this, but it seems to me that as a result of the government having most of those resources, right, it seems like it would be easier for prescribed fire to take place. And that through the conversations I've had with folks through the Good Fire podcast, that, like you said yourself, Marissa, it's very, very challenging for Indigenous communities to get it's shitty to even say it this way, right? But that they need approval. They need to be allowed to practice their culture on the landscape, right? And so I wanted to ask, in that sense, have you seen any policy changes or legislation changes? Because I know that the conversation is there. There's talks in the fire community about being able to get Indigenous firekeepers doing their thing, right? So has there been any real paperwork behind that and into changing our perspective and getting Indigenous firekeepers out there doing what they want to do and their community wants to do and engaging in that way?
Luckily, yes. By no means at the pace or scale that we would like to see it happen, but there are some really good precedent kind of case studies in action now. The Karuk tribe here in California just set up a first of its kind MOU basically with the state, wherein they're looking at co-stewardship of public lands that are Karuk lands and also maintained in some way by the state. And so, and those same sorts of partnership agreements are being discussed right now at the federal level with the U.S. Forest Service through a couple of federal pieces of legislation, one of which I think is the Fix Our Forests Act, where a huge focus on Indigenous stewardship of land, and making that kind of cultural practice just easier is a focus, which is
awesome.
Shocking, because Indigenous rights and sort of the seeing the value in those practices is not something that we as a people or our government has really prioritized historically, but we're starting to see a shift in that. And I think it might be in part, and this is just conjecture, but, we're seeing a pretty significant dismantling of certain pieces of our government here in the States. And you can imagine as resources start to dwindle at the federal level, it's going to become more and more important to make sure that we have some sort of decentralized approach and are supporting Indigenous communities, other types of communities that maybe have similar cultural practices or knowledge around burning to be able to just get it done. And so my hope is that these new partnerships that are starting to emerge will be successful and, expanded and improved upon.
Awesome. That's great. Yeah, I think that's the big thing, right? Is there's this workforce that's been out there that knows how to do this, and there's just, because of the cultural barriers and the power dynamic of colonialism, right? Like there's no way for people that know stuff to work their way upwards through that Western system and change things. There's too much momentum against it. So it's you said the word decentralization, and that was kind of my next train of thought. And Chris, I want to ask you this: what kind of efforts are there? Because I feel like that's the next step. Is this? I'm seeing here in Canada, there's a lot of discussion around a lot of the big problems with fire is that it is this centralized decision-making problem. There is not the authority in local jurisdictions or local folks to actually make an active decision, because it's fire. It's dynamic, right? The decision, if you get on the phone and try and talk to somebody, the situation's already changed by the time you get off, right? So we need to empower local people to be able to make active central decisions to their specific locality, right? So that means decentralizing that power structure and allowing local authority to make those choices and not be held accountable if something goes wrong, because it's fire. Shit happens, right? Like, it goes wrong. And what kind of movements are you seeing to see that centralized power structure kind of devolve and turn into something that maybe is more local?
Sure. Yeah, it's a really good question. So I think about it more in terms of the partnerships that we need to have in place across the state, and understanding that, whether it's cultural burning, prescribed burn associations, treks, events, private landowners wanting to apply more fire, work that the Nature Conservancy does in California, local government agencies, CAL FIRE, the Forest Service, it really doesn't matter. Like, at the end of the day, we do need to be providing the tools and that regulatory framework for all of these organizations to be able to get done what they need to get done on the landscape. And I feel like, at least in California, like, we're getting closer to that. And cultural burning and the understanding of what cultural burning is and what, Indigenous tribes are trying to achieve through cultural burning, for me, was really, it opened up my mind, certainly, to like just good fire and understanding that prescribed fire, at least in an agency sense, many times we're doing it certainly to have beneficial ecosystem outcomes, but we're also doing it from a community protection standpoint. And cultural burning is just so much more nuanced than that. And and I have such a greater appreciation for the benefits and the power of cultural burning on the landscape. And I really do think that with the regulatory framework that we have in place, and it goes all the way up to the Clean Air Act at a federal level, it just wasn't designed for a beneficial fire mindset or approach. So I think what we're seeing is what was meant to be, a reasonable or a good regulation at the time is actually preventing us from achieving resiliency. And so as we come up against those barriers, we need to figure out how we get through those. And oftentimes that is through legislative change, because what was once well-meaning is now actually preventing us from being able to, successfully apply fire at scale across the landscape. And I think it's also really important that we give the practitioners who are well-trained, as well as our cultural burners, that ability to go get fire back on the ground. And it's so funny. And, in many other states outside of California, the number of acres they burn is quite remarkable. And, and so you do have to ask yourself, like, how come Florida has as much prescribed fire and good fire on the landscape versus what you see in California? And there's a lot of ownership, especially among the regulatory agencies. When you have been doing something a certain way or enforcing a rule a certain way for so long, it's going to take leadership to get over those barriers and push through those, because, regulatory agencies by themselves, aren't necessarily always willing to change, their approach to things. And so I think that's where leadership and policy change comes in. And things are getting better, certainly in California. And Marissa mentioned SB 310, which really helps open the door to get more cultural fire on the ground and allows these agreements and MOUs to be put into place. And like, this is the approach we need to do. We really need to identify those barriers and push through them. Otherwise we're going to continue to have these same outcomes on the landscape.
Mm-hmm. Isn't it wild that institutional structure that we created, that's well-meaning, and ends up causing the problems, right, that we're dealing with now? It's interesting that we have such a hard time convincing ourselves that, like, well, yeah, we should pull the trigger on that and change that, right? There's this fear that if we change that, something else might go wrong. There's a fear of taking a step forward because it might put us a step back. I don't know. And it's just it's weird that we have that barrier. Like, well, we made that. It's on paper. We wrote it down. Like, it must be important. And we struggle so much with being like, yeah, but we wrote it. We could just scratch it out and put something new. It's fine. But it's true, I think, in all environmental, like, stewardship areas, right? Management areas. It's just, as soon as there is regulatory framework in place, it's like, well, they had good intentions. They were smart. They were researched. Like, it makes sense. And you're like, yeah, but it wasn't all inclusive. It wasn't comprehensive enough. It didn't have all the information. And I would like to see. I would really like to see everywhere there to be just a relaxing of that, just being like, hey, yeah, we can totally change legislation. That shouldn't be that big of a deal. We can always change it back. Like, what's, you know what I mean? It's just, so yeah, I totally agree. I feel like there's, I've had full discussions about that on this show, right? Just about how institutional structure is holding us back so much, and it's of our own design. So, like, what are we doing? We put ourselves in jail, and we can't get ourselves out. It's very strange.
And it's not anyone's fault. It's just that the regulatory framework that we have in place, much of it didn't envision what we're experiencing today. And so, kind of given where we are and knowing where we need to go, we need to have the right regulatory framework in place to get there. And I do think, like, fear of change or changes in authorities do meet with resistance. And that's why I think, from a policy standpoint, we need to have a legislature and an administration that is willing to push these things across the finish line. And I do believe that we have that in place. We just need to, we need to craft the policy that is, has, the foundational science behind it to be able to do that. And there's such a wonderful group of people, working on that all the time across all different levels. And kind of coming back to CWI, I think, CWI plays a big role in helping inform what those changes should look like. And that's the power of this, this group of people that have come together, because one thing they all have in common is really, how do we get to that resilient future that we all know we need to achieve?
Yes, totally. Yeah, that absolutely makes sense. And you spoke to something that I thought was interesting too. it's more of a human problem than a structural problem or a fire problem, right? But this idea that there's resistance with power, right? Like there's, unfortunately, the reality of human nature is that a lot of people that seek power don't want to give it up, and they're interested in their own stuff. And like I feel like there's always that resistance, right, to change in those powerful situations, unless someone's being held accountable, right? And I got to imagine, I don't know, obviously, but I got to imagine that there's probably individuals in power that are, stopping and halting certain actions just because of just greed and stupidity, probably. Because we all know that's the reality of politics. So I can't imagine it doesn't extend to wildfire as well as everything else, right?
Yeah.
Not that I'm going to ask you to speak to that, but
no, and so, yeah, I think 100% that is one of the barriers. I also think, I'm going to get some backlash for saying this, but I'm a, proud card-carrying environmentalist. But I think as the environmental movement specifically, we trip ourselves up a lot, right? We have this idea of things not being quite right or good enough or perfect, quite frankly. And so let's not do that. Let's not take a step forward. Let's not change that thing, even if it might mean progress, because it may have some other consequence. And that's intelligence, right? It's smart to look down the road, to try to see around corners and to figure out how do we make things the most well-informed and the most inclusive. But we also have to accept that this is happening. It's going to keep coming at us faster and faster, this being either wildfires or just climate change en masse. And we do have to be brave enough, just as a movement, as a unit, to make decisions that may not be perfect. And so I do right now, in this moment in time, as we're relaxing regulations, we're trying to for good fire and the like, we do hear pushback from some of the environmental community around, the fear of what this will mean to loosening regulations. What will that ultimately mean for our environment? Are we going to end up taking out species that are really important to biodiversity and the overall health of our ecological systems? These are important questions to ask. And if we don't decide to take some movement forward, we're all going to die, basically, is the punchline.
Totally.
Which I know, again, doom and gloom, and I apologize.
No, I feel that so much, because I feel like that is a lot of, you can use academia as an example of that, right? Like paralyzed by the lack of perfection. You're like, it's not perfect. It's not ready yet. And it's like, well, we know there's going to be imperfections, but like, let's keep taking steps. Let's not be paralyzed by fear. Let's take the step. We can always change that step again, right? So yeah.
Yeah, one of the things that I would add is, and I think this is important to the conversation, is that when it comes to wildfire, it really is a nonpartisan issue. And I think that's absolutely critical in our ability to get things done. Working for CAL FIRE, my career, it didn't matter. Fire doesn't, as we know, doesn't respect jurisdictions, but it also doesn't respect political party. It doesn't respect where someone's from or what they believe. At the end of the day, it has, the same consequences and impacts on the population, across California and the nation and Canada. And so, so it's one of the few areas, in my opinion, that you can bring people across the aisle together to solve some really big problems. And I think we see that, especially with how bills are co-sponsored, both on the Republican and the Democrat side. And I think that's very symbolic, and we need to make sure that continues. Because this is not an issue that we should be politicizing or creating a divide in. It's too critical. And wildfire is kind of a great uniter in a way. I don't ever take that for granted in terms of, having it be nonpartisan in nature. It doesn't mean that there's, agreement, when you get onto the fringes of some of the issues. I'm not saying that at all, but I think there's much greater agreement on, this being, not only watershed issue, a built environment issue, an economic issue, a humanitarian issue. And so you have a space where people can work together to bring forward solutions that, when they are bipartisan in nature, have a much higher likelihood of getting across the finish line. Mm-hmm. And so, so with that, it's something that I protect, very, very dearly, because I know that it's going to be fundamentally transformative in our ability to solve this problem. Is bringing people together across parties to solve this problem.
Yes, absolutely. Right. Exactly. One of the things that CDBI was set up to solve, right? Like, how do we bring everyone together to do this? Because like you said, it's wildfire is coming for you, whether you voted this way or that way. It's like, let's work together here, right? Speaking to that, I want to ask about some of these workshops and dialogues, and I forget what did you call the most recent one, Marissa, that you guys hosted?
It was our annual convening. We don't have a great,
have a catchy word for it.
Catchy title for it.
Fire talks or something.
Maybe we should crowdsource that.
Yeah, there you go. Right, you get people engaged. Right, then they're listening to the next thing. Right. So I wanted to ask, when those things are happening, is that a comprehensive group of people? Do you feel like you're all the kind of, for lack of a better word, stakeholders are involved? And what is the vibe in those situations when you do have everybody together? Is there tension, but productive tension, or is there animosity? Is there this kind of groupthink understanding that, like, hey, we're all here for the same reasons? We might have different ideas, but like, we're here to work together. Like, what's the vibe? What are you getting out of those workshops?
Yeah, so it's a great question. And as Chris mentioned at the top of the show, one of our main roles and kind of the area where we can be the best value add is playing that role of convener amongst all these different stakeholders. And so our convenings are really meant to be a meeting of the minds in identifying where are the gaps, what does this issue need right now, and how can CWY specifically help push those forward. We by no means have all the stakeholders. We don't necessarily have members of communities that maybe have recently experienced a wildfire. We tend to be really light on politicians in the room and policymakers, just because it sort of changes the tenor of the conversation and how authentic people can be, in my opinion. You
can't trust them anyways. I wouldn't worry about
it. And so we try to bring together 60 or 70 experts that are quite cross-sectoral to try to identify what is even needed, what's going to be helpful, specifically for firefighters. If some new tech or new information comes out, is that something that's even useful on the ground in a, sort of split-second decision-making context?
This is cool, but is it needed? Yeah.
And coming out of, tech, you see a lot of very cool, very innovative, but potentially unnecessary movement. And so our convenings do end up being really productive, high level of camaraderie and respect, some tension to be sure, but productively so. Like, ends up being really kind of thought-provoking and conversation inspiring. And I think part of that is because it's a small group. I think it's easy to be open and honest and to actively, show respect and keep an open mind when you're in a pretty closed space.
Yeah. And also, I think conflict in those spaces is going to be expected. And as long as people can, like you said, respect each other enough to know that, hey, if there's conflict, it's not personal. This is something that we're all here together for a common purpose. Conflict is good. It's an opportunity to try and work something out that otherwise hasn't been sorted out, right? So like that's also not necessarily a bad thing. As long as you have the right people there to help facilitate that therapy session, we're good to go, right? So
I agree. Yeah.
that's really interesting. Knowing that there is some level of like how far down this path would you say we are? Of like I'm not there in those rooms, but do you feel there's genuine productivity going on where you feel like you're actually getting some people are leaving, having their minds shifted and having been maybe enlightened a little bit, and you see continual progression on subjects, and we're not just because I've been to workshops in the past where you go every year and you're like we did this the last 3 years.
Yeah.
So basically what I'm asking is this working? Are we seeing progress?
We are. So as I mentioned, I came from the water world before this, which is a lot more contentious in my experience. Water, particularly here in California, is quite the commodity. It is not an endless resource. And the way we've managed it over the past 100 years is not working. And it's hard to come to shared consensus in these spaces when there is such dwindling supply and fear motivating people, right? Fire, at least not yet, is not a commodity, at least not the way that water is. And if we let it maybe can be an endless resource. So I think that people arrive to these conversations already a few steps ahead of other movements, in that we've already come to an agreement that we would like to be more resilient to wildfire, period. And believe it or not, other issues don't necessarily have quite that clarity of resolution. And so I think the movement that I'm the most excited about right now, coming out of our last workshop, is around the insurance industry, right? We have a fairly entrenched insurance industry that does not take new climate-informed risk models into consideration in their pricing structure or their ability to cover high-risk areas, right? Mm-hmm. And what an incredible world it might be if we could change the insurance industry to actually be make property-specific mitigations that people make to protect themselves and their communities. And so that's something that I think does have real traction. It feels like the next big puzzle piece. And
so we're talking like Firewise, right? Firewise, FireSmart here in Canada. We're talking about, just to clarify, like, so incentivizing through insurance, incentivizing people to FireSmart their homes and their communities. Okay.
Incentivizing people to FireSmart their homes, and then also making sure that the actual rate structure that insurance companies currently use changes to take that into consideration. And so Absolutely. I do feel a lot of momentum around that. Great. We have partners that are talking to more and more insurance companies all the time. Chris, you're at the center of some of those conversations. We have communities that are starting to do mitigation en masse and using it as kind of case study for the insurance industry. So my hope is that there actually can be some true change in that sector in the near future.
Yeah, I totally see that making sense, right? Like if people all of a sudden realize like, oh, I can actually do something for my home or my community, right? There is actually action I can take. It's not all up to the government to save me, right? Chris, do you have some more insight into that situation?
Yeah, so I'll talk a little bit about so one of the things about CWI and the convenings, it's not just, show up and sit in the audience for, a couple of days and listen to panel presentations. They put us to work. We broke up into small groups and were given very specific assignments, to work on some issues related to public health and smoke modeling, urban planning and policy, and then insurance and risk modeling. And so it is truly a workshop. And nice. Because you have all these people that are together in one place to focus on these specific issues. And so you have to take advantage of that in terms of what are the next steps or what are the issues that we really need to focus on, moving forward. And so That to me is the power of the convening and bringing everyone together to do that, and really specific to insurance. So with the Palisades and Eaton fire, that is likely going to be the third largest insured loss in United States history, behind Hurricane Ian and Hurricane Katrina. So that is significant, and so we do have some significant challenges with insurance in California. Insurability of homes. There's a lot of people that are many thousands of people moving into what's called the FAIR Plan, which is the insurer of last resort, a state kind of backed insurance program. And so it does raise quite questions about, are we pricing risk appropriately? How do we ensure that the underwriting models that are being used incorporate data that informs how risk has been reduced or not? Certainly, we shouldn't be rewarding communities that haven't done any mitigation work, but those that have, we should try to help see how that can bring back insurance into some of these communities. And it could have real significant impacts, negative impacts on the entire housing market of California if people aren't able to get the insurance that they need for their mortgages or to buy a new house. And so I think we need to do a better job of quantifying risk at the parcel level, but then also, how mitigations both like within a community holistically, but then also, at the landscape level, how are we influencing those fire dynamics in those different areas? Because if we're making a positive difference and we're changing that risk profile, then presumably, right, it should help at least maintain, the accredited insurance market in California. It is such a complex problem, and obviously there's a lot of regulations and a whole regulatory framework that's very complicated as well. But I guess my point is if the better data we have and the better job we do at collecting data and bringing that into a commons and aggregating it across these different areas, then we have something to show whether or not the work that we're doing is actually making a difference. And then the last thing I'll say is, we don't have enough public dollars to buy our way out of this problem.
Right.
And so with that, then we really have to think about how can we be more effective with the dollars that we have. And I will use Pacific Palisades as an example. Pacific Palisades, obviously was an affluent community and likely would not have qualified for certain sources of funding to be able to do different types of work in and around their community. And which kind of raises the question, given, the economic impacts of losing that entire community in, an 8-hour period, and all of that housing stock and the displacement of human beings. And we knew that was an extremely high risk community to wildfire. Like that was not a unknown. And so, with that, what I think a lot about is, are we making the best decisions based on risk? And I would say that we haven't been, but we also haven't had all of the tools available to us to understand that risk at a really micro scale, so to speak. And now we do. And so with that, then with the funding that we have, regardless of what color money it is or where it comes from, let's make sure that we're buying that risk down in the highest risk areas, regardless of what community it is, because it does have a ripple effect across the entire state when you lose these communities, whether it's Palisades or Altadena with the Eaton fire, or Paradise with the Camp Fire, or Redding with the Carr Fire. Like it really doesn't matter. So I really think we need to start making better decisions in terms of risk-based approach to mitigation, both in the community and the landscape level, and then linking those two together more effectively as well.
That totally makes sense. Could you imagine being somebody who lives in one of those areas, you lose your home and you didn't have insurance out of no fault in your own, like you couldn't get it, and like you just lost all of that investment, and like how pissed are you at the government, right, for not solving this issue that you could do nothing about besides move, right?
Yeah, and
even
happened.
then, you can't even move. You can't even sell it. You can't even sell your house if you move. So you're screwed.
Right.
No matter what you do, you're screwed. And it's like, imagine that would enrage everybody.
Yeah,
Doesn't matter who you are.
Yeah, there are a lot more people that are making decisions to self-insure, which means that they own their house or their property outright, and they're simply not willing to pay whatever the premiums are to maintain some level of insurance. And sadly, there were people in the fires in Southern California and elsewhere that, they lost everything and they were not insured.
Yeah. Just really echoing, Chris's concern around, are we making the best risk-informed decisions? And I can tell you here in Los Angeles, unequivocally, the answer is no. Because we are already rebuilding those neighborhoods in the exact same spots, with the exact same materials, with relaxed building standards as a way of prioritizing quick rebuilding rather than smart rebuilding.
Wow.
And so unfortunately, these areas are going to burn again. These were not WUI areas that were surrounded by forests that are now going to take years to regrow, but rather scrubland and chaparral and the like, things that don't take that long to regrow. And so kind of the pattern of fire in these areas will emerge again, and there will be new homes situated in the exact same place.
More fuel. Perfect.
Yeah, more fuel. Exactly. And we're living in a time where we do actually have alternative building materials that are much more fireproof. Mm-hmm. And, as Chris is saying, we do know what we have to do on our properties to be safe. And we're going to choose expedience over, sustainability, really.
And in addition to that, it's not like those materials are any more expensive than the stuff we readily use. It's like, hey, let's put you can put different shingles on and some stucco and keep the vegetation away from your home. And it's not like, oh, there's this new fireproof material that you got to use and you have to use tin or whatever. It's like, no, it's not a money issue. It's just that's what we're in the habit of doing. So that's what we're going to keep doing. Yeah. That's it. That's infuriating because that speaks to how far we have to go with public perception still, I guess. Right.
Indeed. And, I don't think it's each homeowner's responsibility, especially in a crisis like this, where they're worried about their family and are they going to be able to recoup all these losses. You can't really expect all of these people to go out and educate themselves on building materials. That's insane. No. Right. And so this actually is where government, in my opinion, should be stepping in and should be saying, you know what? Here is what we're going to do differently. Here's why. And, sorry if that's an inconvenience, but we gotta do this for the future to not be in this moment again.
It's a perfect example of where regulation is needed, just unequivocally, without a doubt. Yeah. This also jumps us into another topic that I thought would be kind of the last topic before we wrap things up here. This idea that there is a workforce out there of just like public that maybe they're ex-firefighters or farmers, they're used to fire, they have, they might have pumps, they might have water trucks, they might have resources that can be, because there's people out there when these fires hit that are out there, I'm going to protect my own property, I've got the stuff to help protect my neighborhoods, especially I'm sure in a fire-prone area like that. Like I have people in my life who in the last 5 years have gone out and bought firefighting equipment and educated themselves, and they're ready to contribute in some way. Now that presents a challenge for people that are trying to manage these fires, right? Obviously now you've got these people on the landscape. You don't know their qualifications. You don't know if they're putting themselves in danger. But I wanted to ask the question, Chris, to you, of these people who they're ready to work, they want to help. Has there been any movement to maybe like mass certify people to have the credentials to be in those emergency areas in those times? Because we know there's people that want to be there to help, right? And they can help. But has there been any kind of movement policy-wise or whatnot to kind of get those people working? because I feel like that could be, again, decentralizing this power and allowing local people to make local decisions and help themselves.
I'm not seeing a lot of that. There is a brigade in LA County that has been stood up. It has been from the outside looking in very successful, and the LA County Fire Department and Fire Chief is very supportive of this brigade, and really thinking like kind of more broadly about how do we increase our resource base, at a community level. And I think that what's happening in LA County with the brigade could serve as kind of an example of what's possible in other communities around California, and how you can work with local community members that are sensing that, one, there's a need, and two, they're willing to step up and provide additional capacity during these really extreme events where you're going to be under-resourced very, very quickly. It's just not something I've seen really scale in terms of like what we see there, other than more on the recovery side, the support infrastructure that's in place for people that are evacuated, things like that. So certainly I think it's an area that we can do better in, Matt.
Gotcha. Interesting. Yeah. I just imagine, there's a lot of rural folks that, at least around here, right? Like farmers and rural folks with machinery and stuff like that, in the situation where, say, there is a field or something close to a community, they can create a fire guard in 20 minutes with their farming equipment, right?
Yeah.
And stuff like that. Like there's resources to be deployed that are on the ground. They're there. You don't need to get the cat there to do it. You can just call the farmer and say, hey, can you do this or whatever, right? Like I think there's opportunity there, and I don't think Canada is any better at deploying those resources, but I think that's something that's kind of coming around the corner, right? Where people are being like, hey, I want to contribute and I can't, right?
It is.
Yeah.
And you use farmers. In California, I think it's private industrial timber landowners. And,
sure, there you go.
Right. And, as we know, they have a lot of heavy equipment, and they're already out on the ground. They know the ground better than anyone else. We do have a framework in place for that. And, and so, like, knowing that you have this resource available to you, they have heavy equipment. They're generally working in those areas when these fires start. So both at a federal level and a state level, we have essentially meetings with the representatives for these timberland owners every year to kind of prepare for, how do we work together? How do we coordinate? And it's a very effective workforce.
Awesome. That's exciting. That's great. That's a huge positive story towards how we can start to create this as a society solution, right? Getting everybody involved. Like that's awesome. Yeah, we need more of that here. I think we're kind of working on it, but it's not fully fledged out, right? There's a bit of confusion. So we'll see where we end up. So for our finally wrap up kind of question, I like to ask these philosophical questions where you guys get to take it where you want. And my thoughts were from a top-down view, 10,000 foot view. If you could design, you're in charge. You could design what you would imagine is the perfect fire mitigation scenario, right? Like whatever it might be. How would you imagine that, and how? Yeah, what would that look like for people? What are we aiming for? I guess. What do you think we should be aiming for? Marissa, let's start with you.
Yeah. So again, that big question. I think what I would really want to see is a public that is really well versed in not just, wildland fires and urban fires, but mitigation of and recovery resources, if and when it does happen. This idea of retired firefighters or industrial timberland owners working side by side with community and fire agencies. I think that's going to be a hugely important piece of the pie, as is, Indigenous stewardship of lands and cultural burning and the like. And I think overall, we're going to have to shift our focus to fire not just being bad, but being a part of our world and our life, and knowing how to live with it, alongside it, manage it, how to identify good from bad. And I really would like to see some of the new tech that's coming out that does give us property level information. There are things like WUI with 2 eyes and Fireicide, and some other tools. Those are just a couple where they can come and inspect your property with some really basic kind of handheld tech and give you really specific prescriptions on what to do to fireproof your home and your community. And I think that if we can get that into every person's hand and kind of stand up a workforce that's there to do those inspections and help do the work on properties, then I think you're really cooking with the gas. Yeah,
absolutely. Yeah. It sounds like creating almost a fire culture, right?
Yes.
Personally, I've been one concept that was kind of fired up in me as a result of reading a lot of Robin Wall Kimmerer's stuff was that idea of reciprocity with land, right? And I think through conversations through the Good Fire podcast and that kind of thing, the idea of really understanding that if we can start to understand and realize a cultural reciprocity with fire, all of a sudden that if it's just part of our everyday, this is just something we talk about and think about and converse about, then all of a sudden, the amount of brain power that goes into it, if everyone's doing it, like you're going to see solutions so much faster, right? Like that's just that cultural shift is going to be so powerful. So totally. That makes sense to me. Chris, how are you going to follow that up?
Yeah, I know that is a tough one. I'm going to actually tear off of Marissa's comments because she teed me up so well with this one, and she started actually with resident engagement, and I think sometimes we forget that that engagement with our community and our residents is absolutely so critical to solving this problem. But I'm also going to kind of give a real world example too, and right now, we are part of a pilot in North Lake Tahoe and Incline Village, Nevada, and really thinking about, how do we bring all these different tools, resources, and organizations together to really drive down wildfire risk. And so, and I'll kind of give you an example of the types of organizations that are involved and how we're thinking about this. Because ideally, if it's successful, it's something we would like to see replicated. But it brings together a lot of different organizations that normally don't all sit in the same room together and have like weekly calls on trying to work through some of these issues. But it starts with the residents, and in this case, it's a homeowners association that is very engaged. And then, as you kind of start backing out of the homeowners association where there's a lot of risk. You have a fire department, North Lake Tahoe Fire Protection District, that's very involved in their communities. And as we know, firefighters are a very trusted voice in their communities as well. And then in addition to that, you have a community funder called the Tahoe Fund, a philanthropic fund that's identifying gaps and filling those gaps with funding that oftentimes you don't see public entities being able to do. And then you have the Gordon and Betty Moore Foundation, which is providing, funding as well. We have the Climate and Wildfire Institute that's involved in this. You have your local utility, which is Nevada Energy in this case, because as we know, the work that happens in our utility corridors and that work that happens with utility infrastructure is just as important as what happens, within and around the communities. You have your regulatory agency, which in this case is the Tahoe Regional Planning Agency, at the table also. And then we have a lot of different modeling capabilities. So everything from Vibrant Planet, Xylo Plan, Techno Silva, Fireicide that Marissa mentioned. We have Dr. Mahmood out of Colorado State University that's really able to understand the structure-to-structure fire spread in these communities. We have Wildfire Services, which can really look at the home hardening aspects. And so when you bring all of these people into a room, ultimately, it's how do you bring all these tools and resources across private, public, nonprofit, philanthropic, regulatory, together to solve these really big problems. And like, to me, I'm very tactical in the way that I think about these things, because ultimately, like, we have to be implementing on the ground. And we also have to be understanding how our implementation and our mitigations are actually, making a difference.
Yes.
So, these types of models are the ones that I hope we can carry forward. And in having kind of a cross sector of funders and a cross sector of organizations really enhances the dialogue that we're having by bringing everyone into the room together. So I'm really, I think there's a lot of promise there. And I think it's a model that will serve us well in the future, because it's not just a public problem. It's not just a private problem. It's not just a resident problem. It's really all of our problem. And so bringing all of the tools that we have in the toolbox to really understand the work that needs to be done, where it needs to be done, how it needs to get done, I think it's going to make us much, much more successful moving forward. And so that's really my vision of what the future is going to look like. And I think that, we have the momentum right now to be able to really scale these types of pilot projects, across our local communities.
Very cool. Yeah. Just that cultural momentum, right? Just keep on pushing. I love it. There's so much here to digest, but I think it's quite digestible, right? Like, I also think these concepts they're not weird. They just require you to think for a second, and you go, okay, yeah. So we just need to be doing a little bit more here and there, and just kind of keeping it on the discussion board as often as possible, and see where we can create efficiencies. And this is all totally doable. And that's something that I often say after I finish these conversations is people's pie in the sky view of what we should be doing, or what they want to see happening, is like, it's right around the corner. It's right there. They're like, hey, this is something we can totally do. It's never this big wild change of we need to change everything. It's just like, hey, we just need to shift the way we think about things, and that'll solve a lot of our problems. So, I want to thank both of you for taking the time today. We almost came up on 2 full hours, which is our time allotment. And it's funny how these things kind of take on a life of their own, right? And when you're passionate about something, if the time kind of flies by. So, I want to say thank you again to both of you for coming on, taking the time. This was a very comprehensive discussion, and I think people are going to take a lot out of this, and hopefully it'll help you in whatever you're trying to do. And this was fantastic.
Thank you so much for having us. It was a really interesting conversation, and yes, I hope this does seem feasible for everybody listening.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, and I'd like to say thank you as well, Matt. I think these opportunities are the opportunities that we were talking about, where we can get a message out and hopefully influence positive change. So appreciate it very much.
My pleasure. Thank you so much for listening. I hope you learned something. I know I did. It's always interesting to get in deep into this policy stuff, into this societal relationship stuff, and see where the breaks are, right? See where the barriers are, see how we can get through them and jump over them, and to get a vibe for what the professional atmosphere is like around these changes that we're hoping to see. So if you have any questions for me or any of the guests, shoot me an email, YourForest@gmail.com. Make sure to rate and review. That is so important. Please, please, please rate and review right now. That would be awesome. And with that, we'll see y'all next time. Take it easy.